A now infamous sentence in my playgroup is, "Wow, this opening hand would be great if it had more lands." Whenever it's said, either me or my friend Mr. Hans will sit up straight, get a devious glint in our eye, and say, "Yeah, 9-card hands are pretty good." This is a joke that we'll never stop finding funny, but the frequency with which people express the original sentiment also speaks to a broader point about lands. Despite their centrality to the game, a lot of people don't really see lands as a part of their deck in any meaningful sense. If your hand was missing something else you find vital to your game plan, an artifact, a creature, a piece of ramp, you wouldn't say, "Wow, this opening hand would be great if it had an artifact in it," because that's a silly statement to make. An opening hand without an artifact in it, in an artifact deck, is a bad hand, not a mildly flawed good hand. To take this a step further, I think a lot of people have a mindset of lands being a sort of necessary evil, a card type that dilutes the gas of a deck, and one that should be played in the lowest quantity that a player can get away with. I don't necessarily want to invalidate the desire to draw gas, but I do think that what I just described is a mindset that will naturally lead to deck building mistakes. So to start with, I want to lay out a basic framework for the approximate number of lands that you should be running in your deck. I've seen a lot of numbers paraded around by various people as general reference points, and to be frank, I think a single number does a poor job of answering the question. Speaking of Frank, let's start there. Frank Karsten has done an admirable job of answering questions of mana and mana fixing, and his analysis on the subject of land count is as good a place to start as any for the topic. The format-agnostic version of Karsten's land count analysis goes something like this. He takes a whole bunch of match data from across a couple years of online MTG events and excludes any deck that didn't have more wins than losses. He then does a regression analysis on the remaining decks, which sounds complicated but is actually pretty simple in concept. A regression analysis basically just cares about how a bunch of predictor variables correlate with an output variable. In this case, the question Karsten's analysis is asking is, how do mana curve, quantity of cheap draw spells, and quantity of cheap ramp spells affect how many lands a successful deck plays? The result of this question is then turned into a formula that can be used to determine the number of lands that a given deck should play. And as a starting point, I like this. I'd argue that average mana value, as well as quantities of cheap draw and ramp, should be major factors used to decide land count in a deck, and I've left a link to that article in the description if you want to give Karsten's formula a try. However, since it was constructed from 60-card deck data, Karsten's analysis here misses out on some specific factors involved in EDH, and he himself is aware of this. Another article of his lays out a different set of criteria for mana curve, ramp, and land count in an EDH-specific context. Due to the absence of good data on EDH games, this article obtained its findings through simulated games against a passive opponent, with the model optimizing for the highest quality curve out. This quality is defined here as a single number being composed of the mana value of each card played, repeated on each turn thereafter to simulate the value of having played a spell that influences the game. The model factors in a number of commander-specific assumptions, such as the free mulligan and the commander being effectively an extra non-land card available at all times. And honestly, I like this model a lot, not because it's perfect, but because it's simple and specific. It gives land count, ramp count, and mana curve recommendations based purely on the goal of curving out. Cards aren't Necropotence and Rewind and Aquamoeba. They're hypothetical pieces of cardboard with mana value 3, 4, and 2, respectively, and to assume that they're different from each other beyond this information would introduce an unreasonable level of complexity to the model. So, as with the land count formula, it's a good starting point. It offers some neat recommendations on optimal land counts, mana rock counts, and mana curve, and comes to the conclusion that, for purposes of curving out properly, decks would be well served to run at least 37 lands, and as many as 42 in some cases. This is good information, but the simplicity and specificity of the model mean that, to get the full picture, we need to venture a bit beyond its scope. Karsten's assumptions themselves offer a neat place to start thinking, and I'm most interested in his assumption about the commander. His model assumes it to be effectively a non-land card like any other, but one you have available all the time. This is a decent shortcut for purposes of putting together a model, but the commander of a deck can have a wildly important impact on the curve and desired land count of the deck beyond just occupying a mana slot. Specifically, there are commanders that offer some form of draw or filtering, and these will influence the number of lands a deck is looking to run. If you're building a Rona deck with lots of 1 and 2 cost legendaries, as long as you run enough blue sources to guarantee playing Rona on turn 2, your black sources and land count as a whole can be a bit lower, since you know you're going to churn through a lot of cards on turns 3 and 4. Similarly, a Yasharn deck can go a bit heavier on ramp and a bit lighter on lands, knowing that as long as it's able to get up to Yasharn, it'll have its next couple land drops for free. These examples make sense, as they're cases when a player will have guaranteed access to a high-quality tool for drawing into additional lands. However, I also want to talk about a different type of commander that I think will be more controversial, that being the high-costed commander that draws a lot of cards. If your commander costs 4 or more and draws cards, not only should you not run less lands than you otherwise would, you actually should run more. That's a draw spell you'll have every single game, and your only barrier between yourself and those sweet cards is drawing enough lands or ramp to get there. Ditto if the deck is very heavy on draw that costs a lot of mana. Medium to large draw will cut through that slightly higher density of lands with no problem, so running a higher land count won't hurt you. It will only serve to lessen the chance of screw. And I'll go a step further here. I suspect the reason a lot of people end up running low land counts isn't because they've done a lot of field testing and decide that they need to be drawing more gas. It's because they get finished adding cards to the deck and feel attached to the non-land stuff they put in. Making cuts can be a somewhat painful and difficult process, so if EDHFan99 tells you that you can run 33 lands, a lot of people will take that advice very eagerly, and then down the road, they'll curse the luck gods when they get stuck on 4 lands in their deck whose average mana value is 4.5. And I say this with a heart full of empathy. I've been there. But sometimes you just gotta bite the bullet and make those cuts. Another factor that should influence land count is colors, both the number of colors and the symbol density. Well, kind of. See, this is a subject that's a bit harder to solve with big-brained deck building tips. The annoying truth is, if you want to run a lot of colors and you don't want to run a whole lot of tap lands, in order to actually get the colors you need, you either need to spend hundreds of dollars on a mana base full of fetches and shocks, or you need to run a lot of lands. And I do not say this from sitting atop my throne of paper-mache copies of Ristic Study. I don't run many fetches and shocks in my decks due to their cost, and I honestly find the effectiveness of them to be a little upsetting. If you're willing to spend money, you can run a lot of colors with basically no downside, and if you aren't willing to spend money, you can't do that. But I'm not here to get upset. I'm here to give you actionable advice, and that advice is, if you can justify buying fetches and shocks, or if you feel like proxying, you should run them. If you're like me and you can't justify that purchase, you should either play fewer colors or run more lands. As an example of this principle, I built out 4 mana bases for a hypothetical 4-color deck, with blue and green being dominant colors. The first one was 30 lands, $300, and a 10% tap lands allowance. A decidedly solid mana base if you're okay with the low overall count. Symbols-wise, it's 22 each for green and blue, and 16 each for red and black. Pretty good numbers for coming from just 30 lands, not even including any sort of ramp. The second one was 30 lands again, but $50 this time, and a 1/3 tap land allowance. The symbols for this deck are 20 each for green and blue, and 13 each for red and black. Definitely worse, but not horrendously so, as long as you're okay with tap lands. A well-built ramp suite should be able to patch up those numbers to something that ends up being pretty reliable. The third one was 30 lands and $50 once again, but going back to the 10% tap land allowance. This is where things get painful. 16 symbols each for green and blue, and 10 each for red and black. This is rough. Our core colors aren't even well supported, and 10 is a low enough count for our off colors that we'll quite frequently be missing one or both of them. However, if we dial the land count up to 40 with equivalent per card budget, our count jumps back up to 20 for the core colors and 13 for the off colors, the same as the more tapland-oriented 30-land option. I should reiterate that this still isn't amazing, but it's a good demonstration of the trade-offs involved with building a mana base. I could go into specific cycles of lands and when they should or shouldn't be used, but this video is long enough already, so I won't. Instead, I want to talk more about the mana symbols, and how to know how many of each you'll need. This is another area where lots of people have posited various counts and formulas and such like, and to start with, I'm going to stick with a familiar face. Frank Karsten also posted an article offering an analysis of the number of each symbol a deck should run in order to be able to consistently play a card when they have enough total mana, with consistently being 89 plus M% of the time, where M is the mana value of the card. One application of this formula and resulting table would be to apply it to every single card in your deck, and then build a mana base that gets as close as possible to satisfying this for every single card. This works in faster formats where most or all cards want to be played on curve, but it works a bit less well at EDH. I do think it's appropriate to apply this strict 89 plus M% standard for pivotal cards you want to land on curve, such as a commander or a ramp spell. However, for stuff you need a little later, such as high drops, combo pieces, or removal, you can put them behind a substantially lower symbol count, as long as you've got enough draw and ramp to help you get the needed symbols by the time you need those cards. This doesn't necessarily mean you should totally let your guard down on that sort of stuff, though. Certainly, if you're running a lot of colors, or if you're running symbol-heavy cards, it's worth taking a careful look at your mana base to make sure things will work out. I recommend checking out the chart in Frank Carson's article, which I linked in the description, but as a bit of shorthand, 30 symbols in your mana base will give you great access to all but the most symbol-intensive cards. 25 symbols will give you great access to single symbol cards and decent access to double symbol cards. 20 will give you decent access to single symbol cards and mediocre access to more symbols, and 15 symbols will give you okay access to single symbol cards but will be unreliable beyond that. For an example of one of my mana bases, my Maria deck runs 37 lands, with 23 red symbols and 22 green symbols. The deck is pretty low curved and has a 3 mana commander that ramps, so the lands and symbols are mostly to make sure that I can drop the commander on curve consistently. When I run the deck through Frank Carson's land count formula, it's right on the money, which makes sense to me since the commander ramps, which would make me okay with fewer lands, but also draws, which would make me fine with more. For my Glissa deck, I'm running 41 total lands with 31 green sources and 22 black sources. This count might sound high, but it's totally justifiable. It's a high curved deck, it has card draw in the command zone, and its ideal mana curve is Elf on 1, Commander on 2. Having mana issues in my first 3 turns will dramatically slow down the deck, as it won't be able to get its draw and ramp online, so I'm pretty comfortable with a high land count. In fact, Carson's formula generates an even higher count of 43 and some change, which might partially be because the deck's average mana value of 4.71 would likely be an outlier in Carson's dataset, but there are legitimate arguments for adding lands to the deck. Regardless, a general pattern across my decks is that even when they're relatively low curved, I still generally run a high 30s quantity of lands in them as long as they can draw a lot of cards. Mana Screw is optional, and if you run a deck with big draw, running more lands is your way of unticking that box. I've covered a lot of stuff in this video and have meandered a little bit, so let me clarify what I'm actually trying to say here. For one, you should be intentional with the number of lands you run, and keep in mind that the optimal number might be higher than the sorts of numbers that get thrown around on the internet. Frank Carson's formula for the ideal count is a good start, though since it wasn't designed with EDH in mind, it may be correct to deviate from it in some cases. You can run fewer lands if your commander provides a consistent way to draw into additional lands in the early game, but you should always check your symbol counts to make sure you have enough to play important cards when you need to. And you should keep in mind that if you're running a deck that runs a lot of big expensive draw, keeping your land count high will almost certainly make the deck stronger. A land base will naturally perform 2 functions: achieving total mana values of cards, and achieving colored symbols for cards, and neither goal can be ignored. These goals can be modulated to some extent by running certain types of lands. Running tap lands that offer more colors can be good in a deck that is color hungry but doesn't need as much speed, and colorless producing utility lands can be nice for a deck that wants a higher land count but already feels comfortable color-wise. I didn't talk much about tap lands and utility lands in general because the script was already looking a little thick, but I'll get back to those at some point. Regardless, just pay attention to your mana base. If you still can't fully think of it as part of your deck, you should at least think of it as your little helper. If you show your mana base the love and appreciation you show your non-land cards, it'll pay you back by helping you actually do the things your deck wants to do. Fun update, I have a Discord now, link in the pinned comment, so go join that if you feel like. Though, first you should click the buttons. Subscribe, like, dislike, and the other ones too. Preferably you should click all of them, in rapid succession. I hear if you click them just right, they give you some sort of prize. Good luck.